Well, thanks for turning up. This is Stories from the Front Line, Cyber Threat Insights from Unit 42. Our presenter is Dave Rowell, who's a digital forensic and incident response consulting director at Palo Alto Networks. Dave is a digital forensic and incident response consulting director and has broad technical knowledge gained over a 23-year career in a range of cybersecurity roles. At Unit 42, he leads large-scale incident response, digital forensics, and compromise assessment engagements for clients globally, and has an extensive experience in responding to large-scale ransomware attacks. Prior to joining Unit 42 in 2021, Dave was a technical director at PwC and spent 5 years building their 24/7 managed cyber defense threat detection and response service. Dave, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Theo. Much appreciated. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Really nice to see we've got a completely full house today. But yeah, I really appreciate everybody coming along. My name is Dave Rowell. I'm one of the consulting directors at Unit 42 at Palo Alto. And I have to point out that this photograph was taken sometime before I started working on ransomware incidents full-time. I've aged a few years in that time. But most of my background, or certainly my time at Unit 42, I've been with the team now for about 3 years. And most of my time there kind of covers working on incident response engagements. So whenever our clients get hacked or they have a major incident, we're part of the team that comes in to respond to that incident, to do the forensics, to investigate, figure out what's going on, evict any hackers or threat actors from their environment and help them to recover. I've also spent a bunch of time working on compromise assessment. So that's kind of incident response without the panic, where we go into an environment and try and find a hacker who might be there that they don't know about, and worked quite a lot on those services as well. Currently, I spend a lot of my time on a function within the team called breach intelligence. A lot of this is deep and dark web monitoring and trying to find any sign that any of our clients may be being talked about in the dark web, maybe somebody selling their data, maybe somebody selling access to their network, and kind of work on that most of the time now. All in all, I spent about 23 years working in different kind of IT and cyber roles, mostly on the blue team, incident response, managed detection and response side of the fence. Before I came to Unit 42, I spent 5 years at PwC, where I built the managed cyber defense service, which is a managed detection and response service the PwC now run. And I'm a big open source intelligence enthusiast. So that is going out and scouring the internet, mostly open sources, to do investigation either on people or on companies or on threat actors. And it's pretty interesting, all the stuff that you can find out there once you realize the massive amount of data that we all leak either knowingly or unknowingly onto the internet. Within Unit 42, we are the consultancy arm of Palo Alto Networks, and we basically work on a number of different areas. Incident response I've already mentioned. We also work on proactive services, so that is advisory, preparatory type services to help organizations get prepare for an attack and make sure that they can deal with one whenever one comes, strengthen their cybersecurity generally. We also have managed services as well. That's primarily managed detection and response. So that is 24/7 monitoring and response to attacks that are detected in our customers' environments. And we also have quite a big threat intelligence team, which is actually where Unit 42 started about 10 years ago now. And that was a group of threat researchers, which has grown quite a bit since then. And we publish a lot of our threat intelligence publicly on our blog, but we also use that to feed into a lot of our products and make sure that the Palo Alto product set can detect the latest attacks and is fed and up to date with all the latest intelligence that we know about. But what we're going to talk a little bit about today, two things. One of the things we're going to go over is just some of the key insights from the Unit 42 Incident Response Report, which we just published a few months ago. And this is a wrap up of our last kind of year's worth of incidents. We work over 1,000 incidents a year across the globe. And this is a wrap up of about, I think, 650 or so that we had good data from. And you can go on the Unit 42 website and see that whole report. There's some quite interesting insights about trends and things that we're seeing in in terms of cyber attacks, in terms of what threat actors are doing, and some quite good insights there on all of the cases that we've worked on. Yeah, we're basically going to go through some of the things that we've seen off the back of all of that. 3 key themes came out of that report, probably unsurprisingly, which is that organizations all over the world are experiencing an unprecedented level of cyber attacks. And the things that came out of this report were really the speed at which threat actors are operating. They're getting faster and faster to actually getting out there whenever new vulnerabilities are detected, whenever new attack techniques are discovered or communicated out. The speed with which they are leveraging those is getting faster and faster. The level of sophistication that threat actors are working at is also increasing. Sadly, a lot of the time they're sometimes better at sharing research and sharing information than we are. But you can see that from looking at some of the underground areas and that their ability to kind of share all that information is really good, and their level of sophistication is going up as a result. And then finally, the scale that they're operating at. Particularly if you look at threat actors' ability to, for example, whenever a new major vulnerability is discovered, to scan the entire internet, possibly within a day, find every vulnerable device that exists or is connected out to the internet, and then be able to automate the process of mass exploitation. Some of you may have heard of some of the stuff that has happened recently in the media, where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of organizations have been hacked off the back of one serious vulnerability, and the fallout of that can be pretty huge. Hackers are getting smarter, and we need to come up with ways of outsmarting them. So firstly, on the speed point, some interesting things came out of the report just in terms of how fast threat actors are operating once they get a foothold in a victim's environment. And if you look back to kind of where we were in about 2021, the average time between a threat actor getting access to somebody's environment and exfiltrating the data or whatever it was that they came there for was about 9 days. As somebody who has worked a lot in cyber defense, I'd actually take 9 days as being not a bad period of time to try and find someone in my environment and do something about it. But over the last year, that has dropped to 2 days. Which is not a lot of time, and in 45% of those cases that we worked on, the exfiltration was in less than 24 hours. Anyone want to take a stab at which 2 days they pick a lot of the time to attack? I'll give you a clue. Never wish somebody who works in incident response a happy Friday, because it tends to be that they will attack on the start of a weekend or during major public holidays, because they know that people aren't going to be around. They know it's less likely that they're going to be seen. And dropping down to 24 hours, that's a very short period of time in which to do something. So defenders are being forced now to respond really within hours to be able to prevent a major incident in their environments. When it comes to how are attackers getting in, almost 40% of the cases that we worked on, it was exploitation of internet-facing vulnerabilities, which has overtaken the previous leads, which were stolen credentials and phishing, which were really big previously. Exploitation is really growing now, and that will have been related to a lot of large automated intrusion campaigns, like mass exploitation of critical vulnerabilities, where a lot of large organizations are running those bits of software. But the point is that managing attack surface is really critical here, making sure that legacy assets don't sit out on the internet unpatched, that they don't get forgotten about. They're actually very good at finding these things and exploiting them. And the level of sophistication is going up. So what we're starting to see a lot more now is threat actors using less malware and using more techniques where they're using your own tools and your own services and your own capabilities against you. So once they get into an environment, they're often leveraging your own security tools to attack you, and there's a way to get through your environment. They're getting a lot more automated as well. Playbooking these things out, and the level of speed at which they can kind of operate and build up knowledge in the things that they're attacking is increasing as well. But we're going to talk a little bit about one particular group which we in Palo Alto called Muddled Libra. You may have also possibly heard of this group being called Scattered Spider or Scattered Swine, Octo Tempest. But they are a criminal group primarily focused on financial gain. But we rated them in our report as probably one of the most dangerous threat actor groups out there at the moment. And that's really because, partly, well, mostly because of their aggressiveness, their tenacity, and their persistence. Generally, once they pick a victim, they do find a way to get in. They move incredibly fast, and the way that they operate is quite interesting. But in terms of who they are, so Model Libra first kind of hit the radar in about mid 2020, and they started off with a campaign where they attacked about 130 different organizations in a fairly short period. One of the kind of interesting things with them is that they're mostly noted for kind of targeting software automation, outsourcing, and telecommunications verticals. But a lot of the time they were actually focused initially on supply chain attacks, where they were actually they were really going after cryptocurrency companies where they could potentially get in and essentially steal cryptocurrency. But in order to do that, they were targeting the supply chain vendors that were servicing those companies as a way of getting in. Since then, though, their tactics have evolved. They've now started targeting technology, business process outsourcing, hospitality, financial industries. Probably a lot of people, if you read the news, will know them as the group that attacked MGM and Caesars not very long ago in a pretty major attack that completely shut both of those organizations down. Down to the point that things like their slot machines didn't work. The key cards for all of their hotel rooms stopped working. Most of their capability to actually service the business was stopped. But as a group, they're incredibly adaptable, they're incredibly creative, and they're persistent. When it comes to things like creativity, we're certainly aware of at least one case that we worked on where we have seen them during social engineering using AI to spoof a victim's voice by training that AI on social media videos of the target. So the level of creativity and the level of kind of innovation that they're using is quite high. When it comes to who they are, so the origin of this group is actually primarily social chat networks and gaming groups. A lot of their membership are quite young. I think typically between about 19 to 22, 23. And they're typically coming together through gaming groups and then deciding to kind of form these groups to carry out attacks. Kind of working through different sort of team specialisms. In terms of numbers, we think there are probably thousands of them that are kind of active in these groups that are conducting these attacks. But really, there's quite a few individuals who are kind of consequential in those groups, i.e. the ones that are leading the attacks and organizing them. We think there's probably as few as about 24 who are really kind of orchestrating a lot of the attacks. They are primarily based in the US, but they do have some membership in the UK and the EU. And this becomes quite interesting also because they're primarily native English speakers, which really helps them because one of their key tactics is social engineering. And when you're trying to social engineer a local company and you sound like a local, it's a lot more likely that social engineering is going to be effective. Organization-wise, so they, while they are an independent group, they have formed an association with a ransomware group called Alpha or Black Cat. And they are an affiliate of theirs, and they basically use their ransomware software whenever they attack organizations to encrypt data and steal data, and they use their services to be able to essentially negotiate with victims and try and get them to pay a ransom. One of the other interesting things is though they have this quite big membership, they're actually using like agile teams sort of approaches to compromising organizations. So they will try and put together teams with a particular specialism in a particular area. So they will figure out what they're going to attack, bring these groups together to just tackle this one problem and then move on to the next one and move on to the next one, and sometimes changing the people that are involved as part of that. Two key tactics that they are known by, multi-factor authentication bypass. So anytime you try and log into any resources that you might use and you get this token on your phone that you have to use to log in, they're particularly adept at using different mechanisms to bypass multi-factor authentication. They're also incredibly adept at social engineering, and in almost all the cases that they have used, or that they have worked, that they have organizations they've attacked, they've used some level of social engineering as part of that. They are very, very good at understanding both SaaS and cloud resources and general IT. In a lot of cases, probably know your environment, know some of the cloud services that you use better than your own teams do. They're also very, very good researchers. So I mentioned open source intelligence before. Anytime they choose a target, the level of research that they are doing on that target really quite significant. So they know what they're going to attack before they do it. They know who they're going to target. They will research those individuals on social media, on any kind of open source that they can find, to be able to make, whenever they carry out those attacks, they have all the information they need to be convincing, particularly in a social engineering scenario. When they get into an environment, they're not typically bringing malware. Very few cases where they're actually putting malware into the environment. They're doing what we call living off the land, and that is essentially using things that are already there, using components of operating systems, using management tooling, using security tooling as a way to move around the environment and get what they need out. They also use a lot of remote management tools. So if anybody's familiar with things like AnyDesk or any of the sort of remote management tools where you can remote connect to a machine, frequently used legitimately by IT teams to manage their environment. They're leveraging these because they're not actually malicious. Many legitimate remote management tools, they just bring their own and install them all the way through the environment. I worked on one case where we found 14 different illegitimate remote management tools in the environment that have been put there by the threat actor. And every time we found one and shut it down, they just moved on to the next one and the next one and the next one. And ransomware is a key thing, part of what they're doing. In terms of the campaigns that they're running, mostly it has been clusters of industries that they would target and then move on to the next one. But really their objectives have been extortion, data theft, and disruption. Disruption is a massive one with them because they are, in terms of the level of disruption and shutting down businesses to the point that they're completely crippled, they're very good at achieving that. If we look quickly at some of the attacks that they've been using when they first started, a lot of these, again, were kind of focused on targeting cryptocurrency organizations. But typically what they would do here is, back then, around 2002, a lot of organizations would be using SMS-based two-factor. So you would get a text message to your phone with a token on it or a code on it. You would type that in, and it would let you into whatever system that you were going to use. They used a couple of techniques here, but it was mostly smishing or SMS phishing. So they would essentially craft pages that looked like legitimate login pages for your systems. They would then basically send you a fish message. You would type that into what you thought was your portal, and they would harvest that key and then use it to log in. They also are very adept at SIM swapping. If anyone doesn't know what SIM swapping is, that is essentially, for the most part, socially engineering or tricking the telecoms provider into issuing you a new SIM, which you can put into a different phone. And they've been very adept at doing that and basically swapping people's SIMs to be able to capture the SMS code when that came through. They used a lot of commercial VPNs to hide where they were originating from. Mentioned already about a lot of remote management tools where they would just bring these and drop them in place, and that was their backdoor into the environment. They're incredibly good when it comes to discovery. When they get into an environment, they aren't just scanning the network and looking around at what's there. They're actually going and finding your network designs, your code repositories. They're finding what your business processes look like, and then they're using all of that information to actually try and hide in the environment and look normal. So trying to understand what normal looks like in your environment and trying to match that. Their main objectives at that time were primarily persisting in those environments for a long period of time whenever they got in, because they were using the data that they gathered from it to attack customers of that organization, and that was a lot of the time stealing information that they would have to be able to then attack them onwards. And yeah, they would try and persist in those environments for as long as they possibly could and leverage that data as much as they could. Over time, a lot of organizations started to get wise to this, so they were doing things like disabling SMS as a two-factor mechanism completely, and not even allowing you to fall back to it, because they were quite adept at socially engineering help desks into falling back to the SMS mechanism, so they could then capture that. They also switched from using commercial VPNs to using what we call residential proxies. So these are residential systems and personal devices which have been compromised and made part of malware networks or botnets, and you can essentially rent connections from these on the underground, so you can appear to come from whatever locality you want. Yeah, basically what they were doing is in terms of the blocking for the commercial VPNs, people were able to block those at the firewalls essentially to be able to block them from coming in and hiding their source. People got wise to the remote management tools, so a lot of people were getting better at actually only allowing officially sanctioned remote management tools in and out of their firewalls to run on their machines, and blocking everything else completely. In terms of the discovery that they were doing, people started to get better at classifying data, at making things need to know, locking things down so that not everybody in the organization could access everything on one single network share. So it was more difficult to grab. Persistence was tackled by generally more advanced endpoint security and EDR and XDR tooling. And a lot of then organizations started to get a bit wiser to being a little bit more determined to validate and vet their vendors, and also to lock down some of the access that some of their vendors would have into their environments, to try and make that harder to do. And when everybody did all of this, what we then saw over the last year or so was Model Libre adapting to all of these tactics. Whenever people were disabling SMS, what they started to do, one thing they've been incredibly adept at doing, is socially engineering help desks. So they will phone the organization's help desk, say, "Hey, I've lost my phone," or maybe they'll have gone off. I think there's been some documented cases where they have gone off onto LinkedIn, found an employee who's just started in the last week, phoned up the help desk and played dumb because they were a new start and they could reasonably play dumb and say that they didn't understand the processes, produce enough information from maybe other breaches or personal information that they could convince a help desk person to then change their password and set up a new multi-factor on a phone that was owned by the threat actor, and then we're getting in there. In some cases, they were actually socially engineering the help desk themselves, so convincing help desk employees to install remote access tools onto their own systems, and getting in that way as well. Firewall, sorry, I mentioned before about residential proxies, but they're then changing this. One of the things that the residential proxy networks do for them is you'll find a lot of times with identity analytics and checking systems, they will tell you if a user's suddenly logging in from a country that they don't normally log in from, or maybe the impossible travel. These residential proxy networks, they figure out where that person lives, and they come from an IP address in that localized area or in that country, so that those detections no longer work. People have been getting better at kind of managing systems and locking down data. They have, in response, moved to have much more of a focus on cloud assets. They know all of the major cloud providers. They know all of the systems within them. They know how to circumvent them, and they will actually, again, I talked about discovery before. They'll actually go and look at your cloud environments, and sometimes, very often, will stand up new cloud resources that they will use themselves within your own cloud environments to attack your organization from the inside. And they will make that look like something that should be there. Very often those cloud environments are not as well protected as on-premise environments will be. When it came to kind of exfiltration, they've now moved to a lot of smash and grab, so they will just come in and grab everything they possibly can, exfiltrate it all, and that is part of their extortion kind of approach now, using ransomware. So they will grab everything and just threaten to leak it unless you pay a ransom. When it comes to better detection in environments, one of the things that we've seen quite a lot of now is they are very, very good at both disrupting the response to their attack, to the point that they're actually inserting themselves into the incident response processes. Very often they will go and find your incident response plan and download a copy of it, so they have it in front of themselves, and they know exactly what you're going to do, who your suppliers are. There have been a number of documented instances of them connecting to teleconference calls where the incident response team was working with the IT team to try and contain them, and they were just listening in on the conversations. I worked on one case where an IT admin found them on a server about to access a database which was full of customer information. They locked out the account that the threat actor was using and cut them off. And within 2 or 3 minutes, they dropped off of the conference call. And eventually somebody got back in touch with them. And in that 2 or 3 minutes, the threat actor had pushed a remote wipe to their phone and their laptop for the IT admin that had cut them off. So they're actually responding, and that made the IT team scared to respond because they're going to remote wipe our laptops. And then, I mentioned before, the extortion part now is really down to their ransomware affiliation, steal everything, threaten to leak that data unless you pay, in some cases, very, very high ransoms. We're running, we've got about 5 minutes left. Just to give you a couple of examples when it comes to their social engineering tactics. These are a few examples of cases that we've worked on where we've kind of interviewed people who were socially engineered by them. I'll just read a few of these out, but frantic female callers reached out to multiple victim organizations support hubs and claimed to be assistants supporting executives. So this was people claiming to be PAs, essentially, like at an important business meeting. A big business deal is about to happen. CEO has been, or executive has been cut off from their laptop, or they can't get in to do this presentation or close this deal. We need your help right now. We need his password reset. We need the machine unlocked, yada, yada, yada. And as a junior help desk person, if you've got, one of the CEO or the chief exec's PAs on the phone saying that this is going to be your fault if you don't do this, help desk people are there to help. A lot of the time they're successful in these cases because they convinced help desk staff to circumvent the normal protocols and pressured them into it. But in this case, they were able to kind of obtain PINs, change passwords, and in one case, got direct access to a password management solution. Another example here where, multiple calls received attempting to reset MFA configuration. And at least one of these attempts was successful, allowed the threat actor access to 3 systems on the client network, and then they just logged on via remote desktop. So actually convincing the help desk to let them in. Another one here, caller with a mundane British accent, their words, contacted a call center, convinced several customer services reps to provide remote access to their systems. The caller had the reps walk them through the applications that were in front of them on their screen, looked at data that was tied to customer mobile numbers and SIMs. This was one of the examples where they actually socially engineered their way into a telecoms provider and then used that access to SIM swap target victims that were on that network. So actually attacking the telecoms providers. They first tried to establish access with AnyDesk. That was blocked. So they used a different remote access tool instead, and that one worked. Easy in. So just some of the examples of this group and their level of creativity. If everyone's a bit depressed, we've also got some recommendations, and a lot of these are not technology-focused recommendations because the reality is this group is primarily exploiting and attacking process, policy, people. They're not actually attacking technology, or they're often using technology against you. Some of the tactics here that we're looking at, if we look at the 3 sort of phases that they generally go through. So having robust identity validation for multi-factor and credential reset, making sure that your help desk have good procedures in place and that the help desk staff are actually following them, and making sure that they're not circumventing them whenever they're put under pressure. Removing SMS as a mechanism altogether, using FIDO-based systems like YubiKeys or things that you have to physically have, or biometrics-based MFA that actually has to be interacted with, much more secure than SMS. Training your staff to spot multi-factor authentication bombing and social engineering. And this is something that a lot of organizations do the day that you onboard, and then maybe don't do a great job of actually reminding people about what that looks like. MFA bombing is a really common technique that they've used a lot, where they just send authentication request after authentication request after authentication request. You hit reject, 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 reject. those go on for hours, and eventually somebody just goes, I want this to go away, and hits yes, and that gets them in. The training staff to be able to spot that. Particularly also training help desk staff to spot social engineering and understand when they're being put under pressure, but they still need to follow the processes. Attack surface management I mentioned before, but actually knowing what you have, knowing what's exposed to the internet, and knowing what you need to do. Another big thing that many organizations have, it's becoming a lot more common now, is what's called identity analytics. This is looking at the behaviors of identities and personas within your environment, figuring out what their normal activity looks like, what their normal working times look like, where do they normally log in from, what browsers and systems do they normally log in for, and then looking for deviations from that baseline. A lot of those can highlight a lot of the attacks that these guys were using. Blocking unsanctioned remote management tools, both at the endpoint and at firewalls. If you use one legitimate remote access tool for the IT team to remote manage laptops, block everything else apart from that one sanctioned application. Because as I said, in virtually every ransomware case I've ever worked, illegitimate remote management tools were brought into the environment. Antivirus doesn't detect them, endpoint security doesn't detect them because they're legitimate tools, but they can be used illegitimately. Cloud-based security controls, you find if any of you work on cloud systems, you'll know that there will be native capabilities within a lot of those that will be able to kind of analyze what systems you're running, but in a lot of cases they can look behaviorally at what normal behavior looks like in that environment, which admins normally stand up which types of systems, turn those things on, and when you start to see those alarms go off, it can often mean that an account has been compromised. Another one that I talk to about a lot of clients is consider separating out your critical security tooling from your corporate Active Directory. And some people might go, no, that's security. But the reality is what we see with this group and a lot of other groups is the moment they compromise your domain and they get access to your Active Directory and they get access to all the accounts, they go straight to your EDR tools, they go straight to your antivirus tools and log into them. I worked on a case game with these guys where we realized eventually that they were logging into the customer's EDR tool, and I found some activity for about 2 weeks prior, which was actually the threat actor trying to use some tools in the environment, the EDR tool detecting them. They found the open ticket, picked it up, assigned it to themselves, and closed it off as a false positive of security testing, and actually closed the tickets down in the EDR tool. They were also using the remote connection and the response functionality of that. In some cases, they just uninstall it. So can't bypass it, just remove the agent. Nobody's going to see it. 24/7 managed detection and response. I mentioned before about attacks typically happening on a Friday overnight or over a weekend or on a public holiday. If someone is not in your environment 24/7 looking at all of those alarms and looking at all of those alerts and responding to them, oftentimes the environment is gone by the time you get back in the morning. We've seen this many times. I'm going to just rush through because I want to get on to Q&A, but blocking unsanctioned file transfer tools. Huge amount of time we see threat actors get in and they will find the centralized file servers and they will just upload the entire contents of it. This is why you see, if you ever seen in the media, sort of ransomware leak sites where they say we've stolen 1-2 terabytes of data. That's them just uploading the entire file structure of your file stores and then using that. A lot of that time it's going out to either public networks, but in some cases, particularly with Model Libra, we're seeing them stand up file servers within your own cloud environment, exfiltrating the data out of your premise into your cloud environment and then copying it out of your cloud environment, because nobody's going to bat an eyelid about a large transfer to your own cloud systems. Security and network analytics. Again, this is looking for things like large file transfers outside of the organization that may not be normal for a particular user. An admin might do that, but maybe a person in HR who just uploaded a terabyte of data to mega.com, that might be a bit weird. Using those things to detect that kind of stuff. Tuned IR playbooks and secure storage. This is actually figuring out what you're going to do when you have a breach and having a playbook to be able to deal with it. Secure storage. This is one that I mentioned before. Particularly Model Libra will often find your incident response playbooks and download a copy of them so they know exactly what you're going to do ahead of time. considering storing those playbooks either out of band or having physical copies of them, not just leaving them around on a network share that anybody can see, because the harder you make it for them to understand what you're going to do, the harder it'll be for them to deal with it. And then finally, again, your IR plan should assume a compromise of corporate resources and prepare for out-of-band communication. Again and again, we see this group and other threat actors getting into email communication. A lot of the time, they will set up mail forwarding rules. Particularly with Model Libra, we've seen them do things like people had a managed security vendor. They would create an email rule to redirect and hide the messages that were coming from their third-party vendor, telling them that they were detecting things, so they didn't see them. They were intercepting messages from their incident response team, and other techniques like this, where they're kind of capturing that information to essentially mean that you can't see it. So we'll wrap up there. We're a little bit over, and I'll see if there's any questions, but hopefully that was informative and maybe give you a few ideas if you work in any of those areas within your own organizations about things that you can do that don't require lots of spend, but actually require a bit more thought about what's in your environment and what's lying around.
Thanks, David. If you have any questions, please pop up your hand and someone with a roving mic will hand you one.
Hello,
Hi.
your talk was amazing. Thank you. The best
you.
one I've been to today.
Okay.
You mentioned about, like block anything that's not whitelisted in the environment. I went to some stalls and they were talking about zero trust. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Absolutely. Zero trust is something we talk about in Palo a lot as well. It is one of the things that, if done, and zero trust is not just a switch that you turn on, it is a journey and a long process that can take years to achieve. But that process, 95 probably more % of the cases that we deal with probably wouldn't have happened in a zero trust environment or in an environment that was moving to zero trust. A lot of threat actors rely on the sort of expansive use of credentials, people being over permissioned, people having access to systems that they shouldn't do, things like separation of accounts. Even if you are an admin in an environment, you should have a standard user account that you use most of the time, and you switch to your admin account to do admin things. People often don't do that. So yes, absolutely, zero trust would stop the majority of the things that have probably been talked about in this case.
Hi there, great talk. I've read recently online about UK government proposals to tackle ransomware, so that included the steps for banning any organisations or payments to any organisations that participate in critical national infrastructure attacks, and the other one about reporting mandatory. What do you think they'll have in terms of impact on ransomware in the UK, if anything?
Yeah. The consultation on that is going to be interesting. I saw that pop up just the other week. I think I think it will be a good thing overall, but it's a double-edged sword. Companies will go bust. Some companies will go bust because ultimately we work with many different victims who often have no choice but to pay the ransom if they don't want their company to disappear. Because in many cases, particularly where they've been successful in not only like ransomware cases where they've encrypted the data and also stolen everything and destroyed all of the backups, you won't have anything to rebuild from unless you pay the ransom. So banning payments outright may disincentivize some threat actors because they'll be like, well, I won't attack this country because the likelihood of getting paid is minimal. But it's still going to happen anyway, and there's a possibility that some companies will just fall over. But the trends that we're seeing is that ransomware payments are going down. Less organizations are choosing to pay. In many cases, that's because people are getting better at having offline backups. They're better at having backups that can't be destroyed, that they can recover from. But a lot of the time, actually, the impact is reputational whenever all that data gets leaked. all of the lawsuits. I do a lot of media tracking with a cyber focus as part of the breach intelligence stuff, and it's really common that I see first notification that an organization has appeared on a ransomware leak site. There are more so in the US, but there are law firms that will go straight to that leak site. They will download all of the customer information and they will start contacting that company's customers and formulating class action lawsuits. And I've seen those lawsuits being stood up within 24 hours of the data going live. So it definitely needs a discussion. And those types of systems have already been set up in the US quite effectively. And I think that some of those mandatory reporting requirements maybe encourage organizations to take security more seriously, knowing that they have to report, because a lot of people don't.
That's great. Thanks.
Just one more in front row here.
Oh my God. Thank you very much for that section. It was very impactful. I want to ask, in a bid to protect the tech, protect the data, protect the company, how do you create a balance so you're not frustrating the humans that are supposed to be using this? You know,
That's
for
the
example, the
difficult
PA example you gave,
Yeah.
if it's a legitimate issue, it could be really frustrating because you're just trying to protect, So how do we create a balance?
Yeah, I think I think a lot of, like we were talking before about zero trust, and a lot of the technologies and approaches that support things like zero trust are becoming better. They're becoming less less annoying, less impactful, and I think they're becoming easier to use. Certainly within Palo, we are very far into the zero trust journey within the organization, and we as employees have kind of noticed extra controls, and we have to re-authenticate to things more often. But I think while people grumble for the first month, they just kind of get used to it and get on with it. But the point is that if you don't do these things, if your organization is vulnerable to these things, and you don't do them because you don't want to impact people's productivity, you might find one day that you don't have a company to go back to one day. So I think, yes, we need to get better at making these things easier to use and less impactful on the users, and I think that is happening, but I still think it's incredibly important that organizations start on that journey, because ultimately the company might not be there one day if you don't.
Time for one more. Anyone?
Hi,
Hi.
you're talking about the threat actors using living off the land techniques. Could you just describe what the most common ones are that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, in most cases, I mean, the super common ones are using things like PowerShell, using things like scripting tools that are part of the operating system. A lot of detection technologies are getting much better at detecting those things. Living on the land is much easier to detect now than it used to be. But I mean, particularly looking at modeled Libra, their living off the land has pivoted to being, I'm going to log into your EDR tool and use it to remote access your environment. I'm going to log into your cloud resources and I'm going to stand up my own infrastructure that looks like stuff we've already got, in the hopes that nobody notices it, and most of the time they don't. And actually just using your own assets against you. They will look around the environment, they'll try and find areas that are less well protected than others, and try and blend in, essentially. So that what used to be scripting tools on operating systems is now, I'm going to use your cloud assets against you, I'm going to use your security assets against you. And then it comes down to, again, back to things like analytics, looking at, ultimately, regardless of how good a threat actor is, they typically have to introduce some level of change into an environment in order to compromise it. They don't necessarily know ahead of time, or even once they get access, what the particular user that they've compromised, what their normal behavior looks like, what the things they normally do look like. And that's where security analytics comes in, because that's essentially baselining user behavior, machine behavior, network behavior, and then saying, hey, this person in HR suddenly made a bunch of RDP connections to our servers. They never do that. That's unusual for them. Fire an alarm, somebody investigates. So I think those kind of technologies are really useful for being able to detect that activity.
Another round of applause for Dave, please.